Well, in this terrifying vision from the Revelation of St. John the Divine, we kind of have a mashup of a couple different elements of the history of the Apostolic Church. That is, one can imagine that the two witnesses that give their testimony and speak with great power and prophesy, and both are killed in the same city, is might have been in St. John the Divine's mind, that might have been St. Peter and St. Paul in Rome, which is then conflated with Jerusalem as a rejected city, a city that's come under God's curse. And but ultimately, the message of the Revelation is that whoever those two witnesses who testify together in the same city, whatever they stand for the church and its rootedness in the presence of Christ. That you have the two olive trees that are by the river of God, which harkens back to the prophet Ezekiel, and the river of life. You have, of course, and then the lampstands that stand in the temple, and so again in the very presence of God. And so ultimately, this is the mission, is describing the sufferings of the church as it speaks its testimony into the world, and a testimony for which it is rejected. And that's one of the themes of Revelation, is that the church suffers precisely in its testimony to the victory of God's love. But ultimately, that victory will be won in the bodies of the church itself as they are raised to new life. And that is, I think, one of the primary lessons of the Revelation of St. John the Divine, which is that God's victory, the victory of the resurrection, is going to be made manifest in the very lives of those who serve Christ and his church, who have been most utterly crushed. And so this is a word of consolation for those Christians in so many different countries around the world. I think especially of China. I think of Christians who are in places like Pakistan, in these sorts of places that where Christians truly suffer for their testimony and are beaten, are killed. That God's victory, that his resurrection will be made manifest in them, and that they even now are in the company of the saints, and that God's victory has already been won for them. And so we lean into that victory, even as we stand in solidarity with the persecuted church, that this is really a text for the persecuted church. And let us offer up prayers for all Christians, all followers of Jesus who suffer for a testimony to the victory of God's love, knowing that victory will be won in them as well as in us. A reading from the Revelation of St. John the Divine. I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, "Come and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample over the holy city for 42 months. And I will grant my two witnesses authority to prophesy for 1,260 days, wearing sackcloth. These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. Anyone who wants to harm them must be killed in this manner. They have authority to shut the sky, so that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying. And they have authority over the waters to turn them into blood, and to strike the earth with every kind of plague, as often as they desire. When they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up from the bottomless pit will make war on them and conquer them and kill them, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that is prophetically called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. For 3.5 days, members of the peoples and tribes and languages and nations will gaze at their dead bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb. And the inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and celebrate and exchange presents, because these two prophets had been a torment to the inhabitants of the earth. But after 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet, and those who saw them were terrified. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they went up to heaven in a cloud while their enemies watched them. At that moment there was a great earthquake, and a tenth of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. The second woe has passed. The third woe is coming very soon. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.